From Paris brothels to Versailles, Jeanne du Barry rose higher than anyone imagined, only to fall to the guillotine. Today, we'll find out whether the film that carries her name does justice to her true story, or simply rewrites it for the screen. In today's video, we're leaving England behind and, together with the film Jeanne du Barry, travelling to Versailles to uncover the fate of the last great love of King Louis XV of France. This movie caught my attention for several reasons. First of all, it's fairly new, a 2023 release, whereas up to now, we've mostly discussed films that came out 10 or 15 years ago, so it's nice to finally have something fresh in our repertoire. Secondly, this film actually opened the Cannes Film Festival, and that definitely means something. And, of course, Jeanne du Barry was Johnny Depp's first big screen return after the scandal, and here, he even speaks French himself. So, there's definitely a lot to talk about. If you can't wait to get started, then make sure to hit that like button. And let's dive in. Let's start with the fact that the actress who played the leading role, the scandalous mistress of the king, wasn't just an actress. She was also the director and producer of the film. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll save up enough money to play Anne Boleyn in my own movie. And yes, she's undeniably charismatic and attractive in her own way, but in my opinion, she just doesn't fit the role of Jeanne. At the time of filming, she was already in her 40s, while the real Jeanne was only 25 when she met the king and began their relationship. We all know serving mutton under the label of lamb is considered bad taste. Jeanne captivated the aging 58-year-old king, a man worn down by grief after losing his dauphin and his great favourite, Madame de Pompadour. Precisely with her youth, her vitality, her zest for life. Old men and young nymphs. Well, history has plenty of examples. Henry VIII and Catherine Howard come to mind. Jeanne too was essentially served up to the weary king to lift his spirits. And then there's the matter of appearance. The real Jeanne looked nothing like the actress. Contemporary accounts describe her as a strikingly pretty blonde with thick curls, almond-shaped blue eyes, and a taste for fashion bordering on obsession. Like Marie Antoinette, she piled extravagant hairstyles onto her head, draped herself in elaborate gowns, and sparkled with diamonds. In the film, Jeanne is framed as the rebel against Versailles extravagance, contrasted with the king's overdressed daughters, supposedly refusing wigs and crinolines, even donning men's clothing before anyone else. Throughout the movie, she wears her hair loose and her dress is plain, something the real Jeanne would never have done. She was a spender, a fashionista, a woman who had clawed her way up from the very bottom to the king's bedroom, and who was going to enjoy every bit of that new life. Honestly, the whole vibe of her portrayal in the movie screamed pick-me girl. You know, the kind of girl who's not like the others, who's oh so special, and who believes the whole world just doesn't understand her. And speaking of Johnny Depp, visually he actually fits quite well with the image of an aging king, but the real Louis XV was far more active and expressive, even in his later years. Perhaps the issue here is that Depp, as a foreign actor, wasn't the perfect choice for such a role, which might be why he was given so few lines. The result is this strange impression of a silent king. But, as always, questions of appearance and how we perceive an actor's performance are subjective. History, however, history does not lie. So, let's turn to that. The film shows us Jeanne's childhood and youth, first claiming that she was the illegitimate daughter of a monk and a cook. In reality, her mother was a seamstress, though she often took on whatever work she could find. The identity of Jeanne's father remains unknown, though some sources attribute her paternity to Jean-Baptiste Gomard de Vaubernier. The film then depicts Jeanne being expelled from a convent for reading indecent literature, as if to hint at her early sexuality. But in truth, nothing like this happened. She received her basic education at the Saint-Ouen convent for 9 years and left at age 15, most likely because girls at that age were already considered of marriageable age, in other words, adults. And here comes my biggest critique of the film. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to sound like a moralist, but still. First, they show Jeanne shyly refusing to undress in front of artists until her mother forces her. And then, just a minute later, she's lying in a rather provocative situation, while the sons of her employer throw coins over her, after which she's thrown out and decides to become a courtesan. Well, first of all, this romanticizes her story in a way that just doesn't sit right. The real Jeanne didn't sell her body out of some early realization of her power over men. She did it out of necessity. At first, she genuinely tried to work. She sold trinkets on the streets of Paris, later became an apprentice to the hairdresser Lamette's. Some historians even believe she bore a daughter by him at age 16, later registering the child under her mother's employer to cover up the truth. Only afterward did she become a companion to Madame de la Garde. But again, scandal followed. The wife of one of Madame's sons grew jealous after noticing men's attention towards Jeanne. Later, Jeanne apprenticed in a fashion house, run by Monsieur l'Abbé. So the story isn't that Jeanne understood her influence over men early on, and learned to wield it like a weapon. The reality is far more tragic. A poor young woman trapped in the harsh machinery of society. A machine that still grinds away today. Either you monetize your youth and beauty, or you die in poverty. Jeanne became yet another victim of men who were all too eager to take advantage of a very young woman. And that, to me, is deeply sad. Just as sad as the path Jeanne had to take, passing quite literally from one man's hands, or perhaps I should say from one man's bed to another, before finally, in the spring of 1768, she found herself at Versailles. It was there that the king noticed her while on his way to Mass. The court was shrouded in gloom since Queen Marie Antoinette was dying, but the king's eye was caught by Jeanne's smile. And in the very last week of the queen's life, Jeanne scarcely left the king's bed. Louis XV later said, "I am delighted by your Jeanne. She's the only woman in France who has managed to make me forget that I am 60. The film tells us that the Queen died after 43 years of what it calls unobtrusive rule, and that it was finally time for Jeanne to appear at court. To me, that framing feels a bit unfair. Of course, the film's main goal is to show Jeanne in the best possible light, but I wouldn't call Maria Leszczyńska's influence insignificant. She had a remarkable life story of her own, and her marriage to the king actually began with great love. It's true that she never interfered in her husband's politics, but Maria played an important role as a patron of culture and the arts. For example, it was she who invited a young Mozart to perform at Versailles. She was also known for her charity, helping the poor, supporting orphanages and hospitals, and for that, she earned genuine love from the people. And while her husband didn't waste much time mourning her, ordinary Parisians certainly did. As shown in the film, Jeanne really did need to marry in order to officially become the Maîtresse en titre, the special title reserved for the king's official mistress. But Jeanne didn't marry Jeanne du Barry, her longtime lover, and, let's just say, employer, since he was already married. Instead, she wed his younger brother, Guillaume du Barry. After the ceremony, she was given a falsified birth certificate that claimed she was of noble origin. Interestingly, it also listed her as 3 years younger than she really was. The famous introduction of Jeanne to the king at Versailles, which could only happen once she had noble status, came with its own set of adventures. She needed a lady of rank to accompany her, but unsurprisingly, no respectable woman wanted to be seen in public alongside someone with Jeanne's reputation. In the end, they found Madame de Béarn, a noblewoman drowning in debts, and promised that all her debts would be paid off. Yet even then, the path wasn't smooth. On the day of the first scheduled visit, Madame de Béarn panicked and pretended to have broken her ankle. The second attempt failed as well, because the king himself fell from his horse and the event was postponed. Finally, on April 22nd, 1769, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Jeanne was officially presented to the king. She wore a silver-white gown embroidered with golden brocade and an elaborate hairstyle to match, and she certainly made them wait. The day before, the king had showered her with jewellery, and Jeanne insisted on incorporating every piece into her stunning coiffure and sparkling outfit. In the film, the king gives Jeanne a black boy named Zamor as a gift, and this is, in fact, historically true. We don't know the exact date, but in 1770, he was baptised under the name Louis Benoit. Jeanne clearly grew fond of him. She gave him an education and encouraged his interest in literature. Still, different sources describe their relationship in very different ways. I've come across opinions that she treated him more like a sort of pet or exotic amusement. Personally, I think the truth lies somewhere in between. I don't believe she ever saw him as her equal. It simply wasn't how people of that time thought. But she did give him a chance at a better life. Interestingly, Marie Antoinette also had a young black boy, Jean Amilcar, whom she even adopted. Later, when the revolution broke out, it was Zamor himself who played a role in Jeanne's downfall. He testified against her, which led to her arrest and eventual execution. You could say he repaid her kindness with betrayal. But then again, was that kindness ever truly genuine? That's a harder question. By the way, in the film there's also her pimp son, Adolphe, whom Jeanne is shown caring for and protecting, and whose death supposedly makes her turn grey overnight. Right, grey at 25. In reality, there were only 6 years between them. He was born in 1749, Jeanne in 1743, and he actually died much later, after Jeanne had already left Versailles following the king's death. So this entire storyline is pure fiction. Most likely, it was added simply to once again highlight Jeanne's generous soul and show how special she supposedly was. The relationship between the king's favourite and Marie Antoinette deserves special attention. Honestly, I personally prefer Marie Antoinette, as she's shown in the film of the same name. That one really stayed in my heart. Interestingly, in that film, Jeanne is already portrayed not as angelic, but as a rather promiscuous woman. Marie Antoinette and Jeanne first met at a family dinner in the Château de la Muette on May 15, 1770, just one day before Marie Antoinette's wedding to the Dauphin, Louis Auguste. And yes, don't be surprised, they were all named Louis. The naive princess, noticing the striking Jeanne, was told that this lady was there to please the king at court. Not realising that this meant a somewhat more intimate kind of pleasure, she innocently replied, "Oh, then I shall be her rival because I too wish to give pleasure to the king." The courtiers, who already disliked Jeanne, immediately began turning the young and inexperienced Dauphine against her. The real conflict, however, erupted when Marie Antoinette learned that Jeanne had laughed at an indecent story told by Cardinal de Rohan about Marie Antoinette's mother. Marie Antoinette, in a letter to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, wrote, "It is pathetic to see how weak the king is with Madame du Barry, who is the silliest and most impertinent woman imaginable." After that, Antoinette began ignoring both Jeanne and Cardinal de Rohan at court. Only under pressure from her mother, after Jeanne had complained to the king and to the ambassador, did she finally relent. At a ball on New Year's Day, 1772, Antoinette is said to have approached the Mistress en titre with the charming phrase, "There are many people in Versailles today." And by the way, in a certain sense, Jeanne would later take her revenge on Marie Antoinette, because the infamous diamond necklace, originally ordered for Jeanne, would eventually put Marie Antoinette's head on the block. I already have a video about that on my channel. Don't miss it, it's a fascinating story. At the end of the film, the narrator insists that during the revolution, the two women reconciled. But in reality, after du Barry left Versailles, they never saw each other again. And of course, they never exchanged letters. And now, the final days of the king. At the end of April 1774, Louis XV began to feel unwell. As his condition worsened, his daughters cared for him during the day, while Jeanne stayed by his side at night. Soon, the first signs of smallpox appeared. Jeanne, who had never had smallpox herself, remained with him, along with his daughters, though the film insists on portraying them only as hysterically weeping women. Because, of course, in this movie, all women besides Jeanne are bad. Around midnight, on May 4th, he told her, "If I had known before what I know now, you would never have been allowed to come to me. From now on, I owe myself to God and to my people. Tomorrow, you must leave. You will not be forgotten. Everything that is possible will be done for you." Jeanne didn't argue. She quietly tried to leave the room, but fainted at the door and had to be carried out. She wept in her own chambers, before being taken to the home of the Duc d'Aiguillon, where she waited for news. So, no, there were no dramatic intrusions into the king's chambers, and no emotional conversations with the Dauphin. Louis XV of France died on May 10th, 1774. Just 2 days later, Jeanne was banished to the Abbaye de Pont-aux-Dames on the orders of the new king. Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother, "Everyone with the name of du Barry has been banished from court." Even her mother was shocked at her daughter's cruelty toward an unfortunate creature who had lost everything and was more in need of pity than anyone else. Upon arriving at the abbey, Jeanne cried, "How sad it is! Why have they brought me here?" Over time, however, the nuns grew fond of her, and after 2 years, she was allowed to return to her chateau at Louveciennes. Interestingly, Marie Antoinette's brother, who came to Versailles to give his sister some advice about her marriage, visited Jeanne there, which infuriated Marie Antoinette. Jeanne went on to have several more affairs and lived a colourful life until the revolution broke out. She hurriedly left Paris for London, but later returned and was arrested, accused of squandering France's money during her time with the king. She tried to negotiate with the tribunal, even revealing the location of her hidden diamonds, but it didn't save her. On December 8, 1793, Madame du Barry was executed by guillotine on the Place de la Révolution. On the way, she collapsed in the tumbrel and cried, "You are going to hurt me!" Why? Terrified, she screamed for mercy and begged the crowd for help. Her last words to the executioner are said to have been, "One more moment, Mr. Executioner, I beg you." So no. The film's idea that Jeanne's final words were that she loved life so much was pure invention. So, to sum things up, despite the forced drama and the many scenes that could never have taken place at the real Versailles, thanks to strict protocol and etiquette, the film is still worth watching. But for me, it's a one-time experience. It feels like the creators tried a little too hard to present Jeanne as this perfect woman, always reading, almost saintly. And I really don't think that image matches the real Jeanne. In my view, only true sharks could make it all the way to the king's bed and actually survive at his court. She was definitely no simpleton. Life taught her how to play by those rules. But what do you think? Who was she really? A tragic figure, a skilled player, or, as Marie Antoinette once put it, the silliest and most impertinent woman imaginable? Share your thoughts about the film in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.